Controversy after carrying torches while protesting the planned removal of Confederate statue Robert E. Lee in Virginia.
Neo-Nazis using these symbols as rallying points modern day, and that has to be addressed.
You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
Growing up in California, Confederate monuments were never part of my surroundings. But when I came to North Carolina for school, I noticed that symbols of the Civil War were all around me. The buildings I studied in, the statues I walked past. I found that the controversy over monuments wasn't new, but one that has resurfaced for years and years in different forms. So I started thinking, how did this come to be? It all starts with the end of war.
What's important about remembering this history and the people is...
This is Bob Toller, a former Civil War reenactor and history teacher in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
I've always felt this way even before I started the genealogy, that those that have passed away are still with us as long as we remember them.
The Toller Monument honors 9 brothers, veterans of the Confederate Army.
I don't look so hard on everything a person did in their life, because nobody's perfect in what they did. But I'm sure most people have done some good things in their life, and they just should be remembered, especially for sacrifices like during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. It doesn't have to be a war. It wasn't for nothing. When I go to the graves out here at Cross Creek, they aren't just names and dates. You know, they're people.
For Mr. Toller, memorials are part of a personal history he wants to respect and honor.
They're descendants of these folks still living here in Fayetteville. I need to come here and clean it up. Here's Alf Toller, Gettysburg, and Robert Monroe Toller. I've met quite a few of his descendants. He was at Fort Fisher on the coast when they surrendered.
Just 2 feet away is the first monument erected in North Carolina immediately after war. As Fayetteville lay decimated, women in the town formed memorial associations to humanize the burials of Confederate veterans. They would sew and raffle quilts to raise the funds that they needed. Such efforts represented a wish to honor their loved ones, and didn't seem to be much more than part of the grieving process. Like Mr. Toller, it was personal. But at what point did that change?
It's a little more complicated, probably, than the usual narrative. My work is focused on Southern history in the 19th century.
This is Professor Laura Edwards of Duke University.
So we're talking about Confederate monuments now as if somehow this are about Southern history, as if the Confederacy stands in for the South. And it's just not the case. It's North Carolina. There was real opposition to many Confederate policies and to the very idea of the Confederacy. Many white people, especially from the non-slaveholding West, thought that secession was a bad idea and that this was something that was being foisted off on them by the slaveholding elite to the east. Political division characterized North Carolina for decades.
Huh. Well, if that's the case, why are there so many of these references in North Carolina, including, by the way, the very building we were sitting in?
It was part of that larger cultural and political effort to define the Confederacy differently from what its actual history was by putting up these Confederate memorials. They're rewriting the history of the Confederacy in North Carolina.
A look into the political climate of the 1868 election gives us a picture of what the actual history was. As it turns out, a considerable number of white voters shared economic interests with the new African-American voters. The Alliance of Black and White Votes broke the Confederate legacy in governance by electing William Holden as North Carolina's new governor. Wealthy conservatives were not happy, and white supremacist groups reacted violently. Governor Holden ordered a militia to arrest over 100 KKK suspects, but he was lambasted by the conservative press and subsequently impeached. Soon afterwards, a Confederate monument was erected in Wilmington, a grand event of over 2,500 people, and an opportune moment to embolden the lost cause. This antebellum nostalgia persisted and built up to 1898, when the tensions of the state's political divide exploded in Wilmington.
The white supremacy revolution overthrew the government in Wilmington. Interracial fusion movement had risen up in the 1890s and had swept the state legislature and won the governorship in both U.S. Senate seats and was unbeatable at the polls. And then white conservatives in 1898 planned the white supremacy campaigns, which involved violence and terrorism and mass electoral fraud so that black people couldn't come vote.
It is basically a coup trying to unseat a democratically elected biracial government in Wilmington.
They really overthrew the state government when you get right down to it. It was not an election in any usual sense. It was an armed seizure of power.
And so we see monuments erected at, not just in graveyards and cemeteries and things like that, but courthouses and all of these as sort of symbols that, yes, we've reclaimed this power.
Sure enough, it was at this time that Confederate statues were rapidly mass-produced, their legacy celebrated. From this time on, we see the development of Jim Crow and the disenfranchisement of African Americans. These statues no longer represent the honoring of veterans, but more so a projection of values into the future, one which is explicitly anti-black.
It was to celebrate the new order. There was celebration of white supremacy. In Winston-Salem, the Confederate monument, the person who spoke at its, and he spoke at a lot of these, was Alfred Waddell, Colonel Alfred Waddell, who had led the mob in Wilmington.
Colonel Waddell, the man who said in Wilmington, "How many Negroes we killed in my county, God only knows. But this we do know, we choked the Cape Fear with their corpses." These ceremonies are undoubtedly connected to white supremacy. Racially charged words were not uncommon in monument dedication speeches. Julian Carr, in his commemoration of the Silent Sam Monument, follows the same pattern. He says, "The whole world admits that it was a mistake to have given universal suffrage to the Negroes." It is what it is.
The political climate always dictates sort of how people interpret, understand, and try and protect the monuments. People in our community, people on our campus have called for the removal of Silent Sam, but because of the state law that's in place, they're unable to do anything about it.
This law blocks the process of removal by legally requiring approval from the state commission. And this law was enacted by Republicans just a few weeks after a white supremacist shot 9 African Americans in 2015. When Confederate symbols are associated with white supremacy, what message does it send for the government to protect them?
These are the major public facade, right, of the relics of Jim Crow that are deeply offensive to many people because of what they represent in terms of violence and loss and suffering of your ancestors and things of that nature.
You make monuments and then they make you.
Did you offer the class about
pine trees grow so tall in the bright sunshine? The young boy steals his daddy's fishing line.